Some men spend a lifetime earning respect, and lose it the moment they look old. That was the first thing Walter Hayes heard when he stepped onto the rifle range at Camp Pendleton that morning. The sun was barely over the California hills, casting long shadows over the packed dirt and steel targets lined up across nearly a mile of open ground. It was qualification day for the Marine Sniper Unit, and tension sat heavy in the air like heat rising off the desert floor. Young Marines moved with confidence, carrying polished rifles fitted with the latest optics, laser rangefinders, and carbon fiber stocks worth more than most used pickup trucks. Then Walter walked in. He was 78 years old, lean but weathered, wearing old denim, faded boots, and a tan field jacket that looked older than half the men standing there. Slung over his shoulder was a rifle nobody recognized. It was wood-stocked, scratched, darkened with age, and looked like it belonged behind glass in a museum instead of on an active Marine range. The moment the younger men saw it, the laughter started. "What is that thing?" one Marine muttered. "Looks like my grandpa's hunting rifle," another said. Walter said nothing. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed ahead. At the center of the range stood Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole, 27, one of the top sniper instructors in the unit. Ethan had a reputation for precision and confidence, and everyone knew it. He noticed Walter immediately. "Sir, visitors stay behind the line," Ethan called out. Walter stopped. His face was calm, almost unreadable. "I'm not here to visit," he said. Ethan glanced at the rifle and smirked. "That old thing doesn't belong here." A few Marines laughed louder. Walter looked down at the rifle for a second, running his hand over the stock like it carried memories no one else could see. Ethan crossed his arms. "You lost, old man?" Walter shook his head. "No. I was invited." Ethan frowned. "By who?" Before Walter could answer, Captain Reeves stepped out of the command post. His voice cut through the range like a knife. "By me." The Marines straightened immediately. Ethan looked confused. Captain Reeves walked over, eyeing Walter with unusual respect. "Gentlemen, this is Walter Hayes." No rank. No explanation. Just the name. Ethan looked unimpressed. "With all due respect, sir, what's he doing here?" Reeves paused. "Observing." Ethan glanced back at Walter's rifle and laughed under his breath. "Observing what? History?" More laughter. Walter didn't react. He just looked across the range at the targets, the wind flags, the dust patterns, the sun angle. His eyes moved like he was reading something invisible. Ethan noticed. "You know, this is a live sniper qualification. Targets start at 800 yards and go out to 1400. Walter nodded slowly. "I noticed." Ethan stepped closer, his grin growing wider. "That rifle can't even dream of that kind of distance." Walter looked at him for the first time, steady and calm. "Maybe the rifle isn't the part you should worry about." The laughter stopped for half a second. Ethan smiled, but this time it felt sharper. "Well, that sounds like a challenge." Walter adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "No. Just an observation." But Ethan had already made up his mind. In front of the entire unit, under the bright morning sun, with every Marine watching, he decided this old man was about to become the easiest lesson of the day. Ethan Cole had spent his whole career proving that confidence could win battles before they even started, and standing in front of his sniper unit that morning, he saw Walter Hayes as nothing more than an easy target for embarrassment. The Marines around him waited, grinning, expecting the old man to back down. But Walter stood still, his weathered hands resting lightly on the worn wooden stock of that strange rifle, his expression unchanged. Ethan took a slow step forward and looked directly at Captain Reeves. "Sir, with respect, if he is here to observe, he should stay behind the line. If he is here to shoot, then let him shoot." Reeves narrowed his eyes but said nothing. Ethan smiled and turned back to Walter. "How about this, Mr. Hayes? We make it interesting." Walter tilted his head slightly. "Interesting?" Ethan nodded. "I will put up a target at 700 yards. Half of what we are qualifying on. Today. If you hit it, I will admit I was wrong. A few Marines laughed. One of them muttered, "He will not even see it." Walter glanced past Ethan toward the steel targets shining in the distance. 700? He asked quietly. Ethan folded his arms. Too far? Walter shook his head. Too close. That got a reaction. The Marine stopped smiling for a moment, unsure if the old man was joking. Ethan let out a short laugh. You think you can do better? Walter looked at the horizon, watching the wind push dust across the range. Depends. Ethan frowned. On what? Walter answered without looking at him. Whether you want to test me, or test your own pride. That made the mood shift. The younger Marines exchanged glances. Ethan's jaw tightened. He did not like the calm in Walter's voice. It was not defensive. It was certain. Ethan motioned to one of the range officers. Move the target. 1,400 yards. The entire line went silent. That was the farthest steel target on the range. Even experienced Marines struggled at that distance. Captain Reeves stepped closer. Ethan. There was warning in his voice. Ethan kept his eyes on Walter. He said 700 was too close. Let us find out. Walter finally looked at Ethan, his blue eyes steady, unreadable. 1,400 yards. Walter repeated. Ethan nodded. One shot. That is all I am giving you. Walter gave a small smile. One shot is all I need. The Marines reacted immediately. Some laughed again, louder this time. Others shook their heads. One whispered, "This is going to be ugly." But Walter ignored all of them. Instead of stepping to the firing line, he slowly knelt down and touched the dirt with his fingers. Ethan watched, confused. Walter rubbed the soil between his thumb and palm, then looked at the wind flags. He lifted his face slightly, feeling the air. No rangefinder. No scope adjustment. No spotter. Just silence and instinct. Ethan smirked. What are you doing? Walter stood back up and looked at him. Listening. Ethan laughed. To what? Walter glanced toward the mountains beyond the range. Everything you boys stopped hearing once your rifles started doing the thinking for you. 4. The first time that morning, even Ethan had no answer. The range felt different now. The laughter had faded, replaced by a strange tension none of the Marines expected. Walter Hayes stood near the firing line, holding that old rifle like it belonged there more than any of the polished weapons beside it. Ethan Cole kept watching him, trying to figure him out. The confidence was still there, but now there was curiosity mixed into it. Walter was not acting like a man walking into humiliation. He was acting like a man returning to familiar ground. Ethan stepped closer as Walter carefully laid the rifle on the bench. For the first time, Ethan got a clear look at it. The stock was old walnut, scarred and worn smooth by decades of use. The barrel had marks near the chamber, tiny scratches like symbols. Ethan leaned in. What even is this thing? Walter glanced at him. Model 70. Ethan frowned. That is impossible. That platform was retired before I was born. Walter nodded. A lot of things worth keeping are. Ethan noticed carvings on the side of the stock. Small marks, straight lines grouped together, almost like tally marks. What are those? Walter rested his hand over them for a second. Distances. Ethan smirked. Misses? Walter looked him straight in the eye. No. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, but he pushed it aside. He picked up the rifle carefully, surprised by its weight. It felt heavier than modern rifles, denser somehow. He turned it over and saw faded letters burned into the wood near the grip. WH and below it, a date. 1969. One of the younger Marines, Corporal Dawson, stepped closer. That thing saw Vietnam? Walter answered quietly. It saw more than that. Ethan handed it back, still unconvinced. And you kept it all this time? Walter nodded. Some men keep trophies. I kept lessons. Ethan laughed. That sounds poetic, But it does not hit steel at 1400 yards. Walter ignored him. Instead, he opened a small leather pouch from his jacket. Inside was a single brass cartridge. Not a box. Just one round. Ethan stared at it. That is it! Walter held it up to the light. One is enough. Captain Reeves noticed and stepped forward. You brought your own round? Walter nodded. Reeves looked surprised. You have been carrying that all these years? Walter smiled faintly. 41 years. Ethan shook his head. You are telling me you saved one bullet for 4 decades? Walter slid it into the chamber slowly. Not saved. Reserved. That word hung in the air. Even the Marines who had been laughing earlier were quiet now. Corporal Dawson whispered, Reserved for what? Walter closed the bolt and looked toward the 1400-yard target glinting in the morning sun. His voice dropped low. For the day somebody needed reminding. Ethan folded his arms again, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping in. He looked back at the target through the spotting scope. At that distance, even a tiny shift in wind could throw the shot several feet off. Walter had no advanced optic, no spotter, and no ballistic calculator. It was absurd. It was impossible. But the rifle, and the man holding it, suddenly did not feel like a joke anymore. Walter Hayes stepped to the firing line with the slow confidence of a man who had done this more times than anyone there could imagine. The entire range watched him now. Even the Marines who had mocked him were silent. The strange weight of that single brass cartridge seemed to hang in the air heavier than the rifle itself. Ethan Cole stood beside the spotting scope, arms crossed, waiting for the old man to fail. Walter set the rifle down carefully, and did something that immediately caught Ethan's attention. He did not lie down. He stayed standing. He looked at the range, not through optics, but with his bare eyes scanning the ground, the brush, the hills beyond the steel target. Then he looked at the wind flags. They fluttered softly from left to right. Ethan shook his head. Wind is 4 miles per hour. Slight crosswind. Walter did not respond. He bent down and scooped a pinch of dirt into his palm. Then he let it fall. The dust drifted right, but halfway down, it curved. Ethan frowned. That is not possible. Walter spoke quietly. It is if the ground is warmer at 800 yards than it is here. Ethan blinked. You cannot know that. Walter looked toward the distant rocks. The mirage tells me. Ethan looked through the spotting scope, trying to see what Walter meant, but all he saw was heat shimmer. Walter kept studying the range, almost like he was reading it like a book. Then he pointed toward a patch of dead grass near the 1200-yard marker. Wind shifts there. Ethan looked. The grass barely moved. How did you see that? Walter answered simply. Because I was looking. That answer irritated Ethan. Marine training teaches range, wind, angle, and elevation. It does not teach guessing. Walter looked at him. That is because you boys trust numbers too much. Ethan folded his arms tighter. Numbers do not lie. Walter nodded. Neither does nature. But nature whispers. Your machines scream. A few Marines exchanged looks. Captain Reeves remained quiet, but his eyes stayed fixed on Walter. The old veteran finally dropped to one knee, then settled into position behind the rifle. The wood creaked softly under his grip, like it remembered him. Walter placed his cheek against the stock and closed one eye. Ethan noticed something strange. Walter was not adjusting anything. No dials. No scope correction. Nothing. You are not compensating, Ethan said. Walter stayed still. Already did. Ethan looked confused. When? Walter's finger rested near the trigger, steady as stone. The moment I stepped onto the range. That answer hit harder than Ethan expected. Walter inhaled slowly, then exhaled. His breathing was almost invisible. Calm. Controlled. Like his pulse had disappeared. Ethan suddenly remembered something from sniper school. The deadliest shooters always looked the most relaxed. But this was different. Walter did not look focused. He looked at home. Captain Reeves stepped closer to Ethan and spoke quietly. Watch carefully. Ethan kept his eye on Walter. Why? Reeves did not take his eyes off the old man. Because you are about to learn something your manuals cannot teach. The entire rifle range stood still as Walter Hayes settled behind the old Model 70. The desert wind moved lightly across Camp Pendleton, carrying dust in thin waves, but Walter's body remained completely motionless. Ethan Cole stood beside the spotting scope, trying to understand what he was seeing. Every instinct told him this was impossible. 1,400 yards with an outdated rifle, a single 41-year-old cartridge, and no modern calculations. It was not just hard. It was reckless. Ethan glanced at Captain Reeves. He is not even dialing his scope, Ethan whispered. Reeves answered without looking away. That is because he already knows the rifle. Walter adjusted the stock against his shoulder and stared through the old glass scope. The Marines watched in complete silence now. No jokes. No laughter. Just anticipation. Then Walter suddenly pulled away from the rifle. Ethan frowned. What now? Walter sat up and looked toward the target. Move it! Ethan blinked. Move it? Walter nodded. 20 yards left. A few Marines laughed nervously. Ethan shook his head. Why? Walter pointed toward the far ridge. Thermal drift. Ethan almost laughed. At this distance? Walter looked at him. At every distance. Ethan hesitated. He looked through the spotting scope again. The steel target was fixed. There was no reason to move it. But something about Walter's certainty made him pause. Captain Reeves gave a small nod. Ethan signaled Corporal Dawson, who radioed the target crew. The steel plate shifted 20 yards left. Walter settled back down. Ethan could not help himself. You are making this harder. Walter spoke while adjusting his shoulder against the stock. No. I am making it honest. Ethan stared at him. That answer stayed with him. Honest. Not easier. Not safer. Honest. Walter inhaled deeply and held it. Then he released half of it, the old sniper rhythm. Ethan recognized it immediately from training. Breath, pause, squeeze. But Walter was waiting. Seconds passed. Then more. Ethan grew impatient. What is he waiting for? Reeves answered softly. The right second. Ethan checked his watch. 15 seconds. 20. 30. Walter had not moved an inch. The Marines looked restless. Corporal Dawson whispered, He is too old to hold that long. Ethan almost agreed. But then Walter spoke, barely above a whisper. Now. The rifle fired. The sound was unlike the sharp crack of the Marine rifles. It was deeper. Heavier. Older. It echoed across the valley and vanished into the hills. Everyone looked toward the target. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Ethan grabbed the spotting scope and locked onto the steel plate. It stood untouched. Ethan exhaled sharply. He missed. A few Marines began to smirk again. Walter slowly stood up, calm as ever, and opened the bolt. The empty brass casing slid into his hand. He looked at it for a moment like saying goodbye to an old friend. Ethan lowered the scope, his confidence returning. Guess your lesson is over. Walter looked at him, completely unbothered. Keep watching. Ethan frowned. There is nothing to watch. But before Walter could answer, Corporal Dawson's radio suddenly crackled. A shaky voice came through from the target line. Range command, you better get down here. You need to see this yourself. The radio crackled again, louder this time, and the uncertainty on the other end was impossible to ignore. Sir, you need to come here now. The range fell into complete silence. Ethan Cole stared at the radio in Corporal Dawson's hand, then looked back through the spotting scope one more time. The steel target still looked untouched from where he stood. No mark. No swing. No sign of impact. He lowered the scope slowly, his confidence beginning to crack. Walter Hayes stood beside the bench, calm as if he already knew what they were about to find. Captain Reeves spoke first. Transport? Within minutes, a utility truck was moving downrange, carrying Ethan, Captain Reeves, Corporal Dawson, and Walter. The ride was quiet. Dust kicked up behind the tires as they crossed the open field toward the 1,400-yard marker. Ethan kept replaying the shot in his head. He knew what he saw. The bullet had not touched the steel. He was sure of it. Yet Walter had not looked disappointed. That bothered him more than anything. When they reached the target line, the range crew was standing in a tight circle, staring at something. None of them were speaking. Ethan jumped down first and walked straight to the steel plate. At first glance, it looked untouched. He turned back toward Walter with a look that said he had been right all along. But then Corporal Dawson pointed to the support beam behind it. Look there. Ethan stepped closer. The thick steel support holding the target had a clean hole drilled straight through its center. Not bent. Not chipped. Pierced. Ethan froze. The target itself had never been hit. Walter had fired through the support beam behind it, threading the shot through a 6-inch gap between the chains and the plate itself. At 1,400 yards. Ethan stared in disbelief. That is impossible. Captain Reeves crouched down, running his fingers across the hole. Smooth edges. Clean pass-through. No ricochet. No luck. Precision. Walter walked up beside them and looked at it like he had seen it before. Ethan turned to him. Why did you miss the target? Walter looked at him and said, I did not miss. Ethan frowned. The target is untouched. Walter nodded toward the beam. The target was where you wanted me to shoot. The beam was where the wind told me to shoot. Ethan could not process it. You aimed for the support? Walter nodded. Steel rings. Supports do not. The younger Marines standing nearby looked stunned. They all knew what that meant. Walter had not taken the easier shot. He had taken the smaller one. A harder target by choice. Ethan slowly walked around the beam, examining the exit hole. The bullet had passed perfectly through and buried itself into the dirt behind it. One of the range officers shook his head. At 1,400 yards, with one round. Ethan looked back at Walter, and for the first time that morning, there was no mockery in his eyes. Only questions. Walter reached down and touched the scarred wooden stock of his rifle. Sometimes, he said quietly, a man does not need to prove he can hit the obvious. Captain Reeves stood and looked at Walter with something close to awe. Then his expression changed. He stared at the rifle, then at Walter's face, like a memory had just come rushing back. Wait, Reeves said softly. Walter Hayes. Hayes. His eyes widened. That name is on the memorial wall. Captain Reeves stood frozen beside the steel support beam, his eyes locked on Walter Hayes like he was seeing a ghost. The wind moved softly across the range, but no one spoke. Ethan Cole looked between them, confused by the sudden shift in the captain's face. What do you mean his name is on the memorial wall? Ethan asked. Reeves swallowed hard. Back at headquarters. Hall of Honor. There is a plaque. Walter Hayes. Ethan frowned. For what? Reeves looked at Walter, almost asking permission. Walter simply stared at the damaged beam, his hand resting on the old rifle. Reeves answered quietly. Longest confirmed precision shot in Marine Corps history, before modern optics. The words hit Ethan harder than the shot itself. He stared at Walter, trying to connect the old man in worn boots with the legend Reeves was describing. That cannot be right, Ethan said. Reeves nodded slowly. I read about it at officer school. A mountain ridge in Vietnam. Crosswind over 20 miles per hour. One shot through jungle fog. Nobody believed it at first. Walter gave a faint smile. Most still do not. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He remembered mocking the rifle, the age, the man. Every word now felt heavier. Corporal Dawson stepped closer to the old rifle, studying it carefully. This is the same rifle? Walter nodded. Modified in the field. Hand-cut barrel stabilizer. Reinforced stock. No replacements. Dawson ran his hand near the wood carvings. The tally marks? Walter looked at them. Distances that mattered. Ethan stepped closer. How many? Walter looked down. Enough. Ethan was beginning to understand something uncomfortable. This was not some retired hunter or forgotten veteran. This was someone whose experience could not be measured by rank or modern training. Captain Reeves turned to Walter. Why come here now? Walter looked out across the range, toward the younger Marines still waiting at the firing line in the distance. Because every generation starts believing technology makes them better than discipline. Ethan felt those words land directly on him. He tried to defend himself. We train hard. Walter nodded. I know you do. Ethan frowned. Then why act like we do not? Walter turned toward him. Because I watched. You laughed before you looked. That sentence hit deeper than Ethan expected. He had no answer. Reeves motioned toward the truck. We should head back. But before they moved, Walter walked around the steel beam and knelt near the dirt where the bullet had buried itself. After a moment he pulled it out, bent but intact. He held it in his palm and stared at it. Ethan watched him. 41 years you carried that bullet, and you used it today? Walter nodded. Some promises take time. Ethan looked at him carefully. Promise to who? Walter stood, slipping the bent round into his jacket pocket. His face changed for the first time that day. Not cold. Not calm. Heavy. To the man who taught me how to shoot. Ethan noticed Captain Reeves lower his head slightly, like he understood there was more to that story. As they climbed back into the truck, Ethan kept looking at Walter. For the first time, it was not with doubt. It was with the uneasy feeling that the biggest lesson of the day had not even started yet. The truck rolled back toward the firing line, but the silence inside felt heavier than before. Ethan Coles sat across from Walter Hayes, staring at the old rifle resting across the veteran's lap. Just an hour earlier, Ethan had seen it as a relic. Now it looked different. Not old. Proven. The Marines waiting at the range immediately gathered when the truck stopped. They could tell something had changed. Corporal Dawson jumped out first and said nothing, which made everyone even more curious. Captain Reeves stepped forward and faced the unit. The shot was confirmed. Murmurs spread instantly. Ethan stepped down last, his face serious. One of the younger Marines asked, Did he hit it? Ethan looked at Walter, then answered, No. He chose something smaller. That confused everyone. Reeves pointed toward the range. He put a round through the rear support beam at 1,400 yards. The entire line went silent. Some Marines laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. But Ethan was not smiling. That was enough to make them stop. Walter walked past them, heading toward the command building. Ethan followed. He could not stop himself. Why did you really come? Here? Walter kept walking. Captain Reeves asked me? Ethan frowned. Why? Before Walter could answer, Reeves opened the door to headquarters and motioned them inside. Along the far wall hung the Hall of Honor, lined with framed photos, medals, and plaques. Walter's eyes moved across them like he had not seen them in years. Reeves stopped in front of one plaque and pointed. Ethan stepped closer. There it was. Walter Hayes. Underneath was the record. Precision shot. Classified mission. 1,387 yards. Confirmed under combat conditions. Ethan stared at it. You were telling the truth. Walter looked at the plaque without pride. Truth does not care if people believe it. Ethan noticed another name engraved beneath Walter's. Samuel Briggs. He looked at Walter. That the man who taught you? Walter nodded. Best shooter I ever knew. Ethan looked confused. Then why is his name under yours? Walter's face hardened, but not with anger. Memory. Because that shot was supposed to be his. Ethan waited. Walter took a slow breath. 41 years ago, Briggs handed me that last round. Said if I made it home, I would know when to use it. Ethan looked at the bent bullet in Walter's pocket, suddenly understanding. Walter had carried that promise for decades. Not as a weapon. As a memory. Reeves looked at Ethan. Do you know who Samuel Briggs trained? Ethan shook his head. Reeves gave a small smile. Colonel Mitchell. The man who trained me. Ethan's eyes widened. The chain hit him all at once. Walter was not just some old sniper. He was part of the foundation of everything they were learning. Walter looked at the younger Marine. Your captain learned from a man who learned from my teacher. Which means, in a way, so did you. Ethan felt the weight of that truth. Hours ago he had laughed at Walter like he was outdated. Now he realized the very skills he respected had roots that reached back to this man standing in front of him. Walter turned to leave. But Ethan stopped him. Wait. Walter paused. Ethan looked down, struggling for the words. For the first time in years, Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole did not feel like the expert in the room. Ethan Cole stood in front of Walter Hayes, the Hall of Honor behind them, and for the first time that day, his pride felt smaller than the truth standing in front of him. The room was quiet. Captain Reeves watched without saying a word. The younger Marines gathered near the doorway, all waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan looked down for a moment, then back up at Walter. I owe you an apology. The words came slower than he expected. Walter studied him, calm as always. Ethan continued. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I saw your age, your rifle, and I thought I had already figured you out. Walter nodded slightly. That is what young men do. Ethan almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. And I was wrong. Walter stepped closer and looked at Ethan with the kind of patience only time could build. Wrong is not failure, son. Staying wrong is. Those words settled into Ethan harder than anything else he had heard all day. He looked at the old rifle again, then at the carved marks in the stock. Every scratch, every dent, every tally carried years he could not imagine. Not stories. Lessons. Walter reached into his jacket and pulled out the bent brass round. The same bullet he had carried for 41 years. He turned it over in his hand, then held it out to Ethan. Ethan looked confused. What is this? Walter placed it in his palm. Proof. Ethan stared at the twisted brass. Proof of what? Walter closed Ethan's fingers around it. That one shot, taken at the right moment, matters more than 100 rushed ones. Ethan looked at the bullet like it weighed 10 pounds. He understood it was not about shooting anymore. It was about patience. Discipline. Respect. Captain Reeves stepped forward. Staff Sergeant Cole. Ethan looked up. Yes, sir? Reeves nodded toward Walter. You asked for a lesson this morning? Looks like you got one. A few Marines smiled quietly. Not mocking. Respectful. Ethan turned back to Walter. How do I carry this forward? Walter looked at the Hall of Honor wall, then at the Marines standing there. Same way it got to you. You learn it. Then you pass it on. Ethan nodded slowly. Walter picked up the old rifle and began walking toward the exit. Halfway to the door, Ethan called after him. Will I ever see you again? Walter stopped but did not turn around. That depends. Ethan frowned. On what? Walter looked over his shoulder. On whether you listen before you laugh next time. That brought the first real smile Ethan had all day. Walter stepped outside into the California sun and walked across the base like he had arrived, quiet and unnoticed, but this time every Marine on that range watched him with respect. No one laughed. No one spoke. They just watched. Ethan stood there holding the bent brass round, feeling its weight and understanding what Walter meant. Rifles changed. Technology changed. Distances changed. But the man behind the shot was what mattered most. Years later, Ethan would tell every sniper class the same thing before training began. He would hold up that bent round and say, The deadliest weapon in the world is not the rifle. It is the discipline of the person carrying it. And every time he said it, he thought of the old man with the forgotten rifle who taught an entire generation to stop looking at age and start looking at truth. Ethan Cole stood in front of Walter Hayes, the Hall of Honor behind them, and for the first time that day, he felt the weight of his own words. Every joke, every smirk, every assumption played back in his mind. The old man he had dismissed was standing in front of him not as a relic, but as part of the very history Ethan had built his career on. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, then looked back up. "I owe you an apology." The room was silent. Captain Reeves watched without speaking. Walter studied Ethan for a long second, as if measuring whether the words were real. Ethan continued, "I judged you before I understood who you were. I saw an old rifle and thought that meant old skills." Walter gave a small nod. "That is how most people think." Ethan shook his head. "Not anymore." Walter looked toward the Hall of Honor, at the names on the wall. "Good." Ethan hesitated, then asked the question that had been building in his mind all day. "Why did you not tell us who you were from the start?" Walter smiled faintly. "Because respect given for a name is borrowed. Respect earned in silence lasts longer." That answer stayed in the room like it belonged there. Ethan looked at the old rifle one more time. "What happens to it now?" Walter rested his hand on the scarred wood. "It goes home." Ethan looked disappointed, though he did not hide it. Walter noticed. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the bent brass round, the one he had dug from the dirt. He held it in his palm for a moment, then placed it in Ethan's hand. Ethan stared at it. "What is this for?" Walter closed Ethan's fingers around it. "A reminder." Ethan looked up. "Of what?" Walter's eyes locked onto his. "That a weapon is only as steady as the man behind it." Ethan stood completely still. He understood now. It was not about rifles. Not about records. Not even about skill. It was about patience, discipline, and humility. The things no machine could replace. Walter turned toward the door and began walking out. Ethan called after him. "Will I see you again?" Walter stopped, but did not turn around. "Only if you forget the lesson." Then he walked out into the bright California sun, carrying the rifle that had outlived wars, generations, and doubt itself. Later that afternoon, the Marines returned to the range. But something had changed. The jokes were gone. The confidence was quieter. The younger men studied the wind flags longer. They watched the dust. They listened. Ethan stood at the firing line holding the bent brass round in his pocket. Before every shot, he touched it. Not for luck. For memory. Captain Reeves walked beside him and asked, "What did you learn today?" Ethan looked out across the 1,400-yard range and answered without hesitation. "That experience does not age. Pride does." Reeves smiled. Months later, Ethan would become one of the top instructors in the unit. But his first lesson to every new Marine was never about optics or distance. It was always the same. Do not laugh at what you do not understand. And somewhere far from Camp Pendleton, in a quiet house filled with old photographs and older memories, Walter Hayes placed his rifle above the fireplace and finally let 41 years of waiting come to an end.